very pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Shane Stansbury, who's on the faculty here at Duke Law School. Shane came to us from the Southern District of New York, which I kind of call the special forces of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And he's going to be discussing with one of our most popular speakers at our Lens conferences, across time, and that's Dean Chang. Dean always has interesting things to say. He is the right person. He just keeps his finger on the pulse of so many activities. I'm really excited to see this. So, Shane, over to you.
Great, thank you, Charlie. And this is a real pleasure for me. Number one, we'll be able to give you a Zoom break, which I'm sure is sorely needed at this point. But it's also my sincere pleasure to be here with Dean. As was mentioned, he's a very popular guest, a repeat player, so we're glad to have him back. So for those who don't know, Dean is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he specializes in Chinese political and security affairs. And the title of our discussion today is Current Issues in the Challenge of China, which I'm sure, Dean, we can cover in 50 minutes or less. But you'll see also on the conference schedule, you'll see this is a working lunch, but not to fear, Dean and I will not be eating during this conversation, which I'm sure you're pleased to hear. But if you want, go ahead. Sandwiches are encouraged, and multitasking is encouraged around here. And what goes better with a roast beef sandwich than a deep dive on U.S.-China policy? So Dean is going to give us some of his own remarks, and then I'm going to sort of fade out into the background a bit. But I'll just tee it up by saying that one of the things I love about Dean is that he's always informative, in part because he provides a cultural and political perspective from the Chinese side of things that helps us better understand what we're reading in the headlines. And I think we'll get some of that today. As he's speaking, feel free to put in some questions in the Q&A tool, and we'll get to those as we go along. So when Dean's finished, I'll reappear and we'll get into some of the questions. So Dean, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you to Lens for the opportunity to be here again, albeit virtually. My wife and I have actually become quite accustomed to coming down to the far warmer and sunnier climes of North Carolina from up here in the Washington, D.C. area. One of the challenges of being a repeat speaker is that I really would prefer not to repeat the exact same presentation. So when I was asked to speak this year, I talked to Professor Stansbury, Shane, and said, what would be of mutual interest? And we thought that perhaps some discussion about how China approaches the realm of intelligence, information gathering, would be both topical and of interest. So let me begin by noting, broadly speaking, what are key intelligence functions? Really, it's two things. One is collecting information, and the other is analyzing information. It doesn't matter whether you are the CIA, the Ministry for State Security, the KGB, BND of Germany. These are things that every intelligence organization does. Where they differentiate, and particularly for the Chinese, is that information gathering is not just about military and security issues. Very high on their priorities are things like economic intelligence, political intelligence, intelligence about individual decision makers, and again, not always in the political realm, President Biden, President Trump, but also key business leaders, key opinion makers, etc. The purpose of this information collection, no matter who you are, is to identify potential threats, both internal and external. But the Chinese have a very different take on what constitutes a threat. We'll get to that. And the other aspect, as I said, is to analyze information, to understand the information that's been collected. What does it mean? How does it fit in? To make that information useful to ultimately decision. Something to keep in mind when is about the Chinese perspective on the world is that we have transitioned from the industrial age to the information age. What this means is that the very currency of national and international power has evolved. In the industrial age, what mattered was the ability to make stuff. How many tons of iron ore did you smelt a year? How many merchant ships did you produce? How many tanks do you have in your inventory? It's not to say that these things don't matter anymore, but rather the key thing today in the information age, because of the revolution in information and communications technology, is the ability to generate, to transmit, to analyze, and to exploit information, to do so more rapidly and more accurately than your competitors. So as a result, gathering and analyzing information, the central function of intelligence entities, is more important than ever before. It is now central to national strength and international relevance. And information, again, especially from the Chinese point of view, is not just about military or even economic information. It is much broader. This fits in with the Chinese concept of comprehensive national power. Comprehensive national power is a term that actually the Japanese came up with in the 1980s. And the idea is how do you compare a Brazil, a China, a Japan, the United States? And the answer is that comprehensive national power touches on multiple elements. Military power, of course, matters. You can't defend yourself. You're not much for power. But military power by itself, as the Chinese saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union, is a frail weak. So what else is this? Well, you need economic strength. That was where the Soviets fell down. You need to have the potential power of economics backing up the actual power, the hard power of military capability. You need diplomatic respect. Do other people care what you think? You need political unity. How do you move the country forward? You need science and technology, because you don't want to simply make other people's t-shirts and washing machines. You want to move up the value chain of the supply chain. And finally, one of the things that we don't tend to think about is cultural security. And this has been actually a major issue dating back at least to around 2009, 2010, when Hu Jintao began to incorporate issues of cultural security into his reports to the National People's Congress and the party congresses. Are you, if you're Chinese, are you proud of being Chinese? Are you proud of your culture? Do you feel that, and do you want to spread that culture? Do others look to your culture as a matter of pride? And that is, again, an important consideration, because in many ways, culture too is about information. For the CCP, there are certain core interests, and they're fairly straightforward, and they have publicly discussed what these core interests are. The first, party rule, maintaining the control of the Chinese Communist Party over China. Second, territorial integrity and issues of national sovereignty. This is why Taiwan is an issue. Taiwan is part of China, always has been, always will. Tibet is part of China, always has, always will be. Xinjiang is part of China, always has, always will. The South China Sea is part of China. And finally, sustaining economic growth. Because at the end of the day, CCP rule is founded upon party legitimacy. And nothing says legitimacy like not only ensuring that your current populace has jobs, but the promise that their children will live better than they do, which is mostly a function of economic growth. So preservation of CCP rule is central to national security. Preserving party legitimacy is how you preserve CCP rule. Developing comprehensive national power is how you preserve party legitimacy, which is how you preserve CCP rule. When we talk about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, it's important to recognize several aspects. First is that it is a Leninist, it is a Marxist-Leninist organization, but above all, it is Leninist, by which we mean it is the sole source of political authority in China. It is the focal point of both the state and party level activities. PRC governance is very different from the Western approach. The CCP sets policy goals for China. The state, all the bureaucracy, the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Ministry of Posts, the Ministry of Power, the Foreign Ministry, these organizations and entities with their large bureaucracies implement policy. But what you have is essentially a bifurcated setup. Yang Jiechi is the state counselor for foreign affairs. That's on the state side. He is also on the Politburo, 24 people who really run China, of which the Politburo Standing Committee, a subsidiary of 7 people at the moment, really represents the top leadership. Why do I bring this up? Because he is the first foreign ministry senior bureaucrat, the state counselor is actually above the foreign ministry, to be on the Politburo in almost 20 years. Between 1999 and 2017, the Chinese foreign ministers were not on the Politburo. So foreign policy direction and goals were being set without the foreign ministry being at the table. Borrow a line from Hamilton, they weren't in the room when it happens. And that changed very much in 2017 when Yang Jiechi was elevated into the Politburo. Given the centrality of maintaining party control, I'm going to suggest that this is not just about keeping Xi Jinping in power, it is keeping the CCP in power. And while Xi Jinping is arguably the strongest leader China has had since Deng Xiaoping, even now, it is not clear that he is the sole dictator, the way, say, Mao was, although he places upon himself a lot of symbolism and a lot of parallels to Mao. It's not clear that he has quite that level. So I think it is more useful to recognize that it is the CCP that is in charge, with Xi Jinping very much foremost, and the others trailing behind, but not quite just by himself. The other thing to keep in mind is China's internal context is different. In the West, we value civil society. There are realms outside of political influence and power, although these days that may be harder to find. But there are NGOs, religious organizations, sports, and other things are, for the most part, beyond the realm of politics, or at least they generally have. In this PRC, there is no real civil society. Nothing is beyond the reach of a party. And indeed, the Chinese themselves have said that wherever there are 3 people present, there should be a party member among. So nothing is beyond the reach of the party, certainly not religious organizations. This is part of the reason why the Chinese have been pushing the Vatican so hard, to reveal the names of their hidden bishops, to have a say in who gets appointed a bishop in China. But this is also true for bowling leagues, housing authorities, etc. There is nothing that the party does not have the ability to call upon. What about the economy? Well, there are private companies, key industries, steel sector, chemical sector, petrochemical sector, shipbuilding, aviation and aerospace. All of these are dominated, or almost entirely, in some cases, entirely comprised of state-owned enterprises. And the financial sector, the banking system, is, for all intents and purposes, entirely run by the state. Even therefore, companies that are nominally private, Huawei is a private company, will nonetheless heed state direction. And indeed, the national security law, the national cybersecurity law, other laws all explicitly state, whether you're a private company or not, you must provide data to the government on request, maintain certain records, etc. Even Jack Ma, the wealthiest person in China, who is a party member, is not running a state-owned enterprise, has now learned there are real limits to his freedom of action. So in this context, where there is no civil society, where the party legitimacy is one of the foremost concerns, what are the threats that the CCP perceives? The foremost vulnerability has always been internal, but internal and external threats are also linked. When we look at the so-called century of humiliation, 1839 to 1949, China was at its weakest. Yes, China suffered foreign intervention, everything from the Opium War to the 2 wars with Japan. But in the Chinese telling, this was possible because China itself had weakened, because you had the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest war of the 19th century, 20 to 30 million dead, all done with swords and spears. Firearms were relatively limited, because China had failed to modernize, because the Qing dynasty had rejected modern science. And so while China's outlook today is that the international system is relatively stable and with limited prospects for war in the near term, that doesn't mean that all is well and good. Other states are not friendly. The United States in particular is seen as trying to contain China, limit its power and influence, and undermine CCP rule. And this is not simply because President Trump or President Biden says something, but because of entities such as Disney, entities such as the internet, where they are sending messages that undermine the idea that civil society is off limits. It shouldn't exist, really, or that freedom of conscience that by the individual is acceptable. So China's intelligence services have to function against both. In terms of internal security, what we see is totalitarianism in the information age. China has very substantial internal security forces, and indeed, when we have access to Chinese budget figures, which is very spotty, what we have noticed is a trend whereby internal security spending was not only rising faster than external security spending. What is internal security spending? People's armed police, provincial level people's armed police, Ministry for Public Security, provincial level security forces. When gathered in toto, not only was it rising faster than the People's Liberation Army budget, but was actually exceeding the PLA budget. If you know how much you spend shows how much you care. Very clearly, internal security is a big piece of what the Chinese leadership cares about. Also, of course, the PRC spends an enormous effort monitoring their own population. Some of you may have heard about the social credit score system, where everything you do on your cell phone through your various electronic accounts is all gathered together as data that produces a score. If your score is too low, you cannot buy a train ticket, never mind a plane ticket. You cannot travel within China. Your job prospects are influenced by your social credit score. You have things like the Great Firewall of China, which monitors internet communications, also social media communications. One of the interesting things is that in studies of the use of sensors, both C and S, that the Chinese actively try to prevent groups from organizing. It doesn't matter what the message is. If you want to organize a demonstration at the corner of Fifth and Vine saying Xi Jinping is wonderful and great and we should all get together to support him, that is as likely, maybe even more likely to be cracked down upon than simply sending messages saying Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh, which, by the way, is banned. Winnie the Pooh is actually banned in China because of claims like that. And of course, we have ethnic monitoring. The Uyghurs have, in particular, been in the news a lot. With regards to external security, this is much more similar, analogous to foreign functions. You have military and security espionage, of course, although what is striking here is that China has access because of the lack of civil society, because of things like civil-military fusion or civil-military integration, the employment of non-traditional assets. So China's vast fishing fleet doubles as information gathering because many of those fishing boats are also part of the naval militia. And so when the fishing boats are scattered everywhere around the world, they also are keeping an eye out for, oh, look, there's a US aircraft carrier on the horizon. Oh, look, here is a French or an American or somebody else cable laying. The PRC gathers information to defend against foreign threats, but also to develop comprehensive national power, because developing comprehensive national power, as I indicated, is promoting national security. So sustaining and advancing Chinese science and technology, identifying and countering attacks on the CCP, all of these are part of the external security function that we may not think of as intelligence, but the Chinese do. The Chinese also have a very different approach to gathering information. It's been said that if we want to figure out what a beach is like, we'll take lots of overhead pictures and we'll do computer modeling and we'll produce a perfect, almost holodeck-like image of the beach. In the Chinese case, they'll send 1 million tourists, and each will be instructed to bring back 1 teaspoon, maybe just 1 grain of sand. And they will use that 1 million teaspoons or 1 million grains of sand to literally rebuild the beach. It's a very different approach. It takes advantage of China's numbers. A couple of other things just to keep in mind. the Chinese leadership has a much expanded tool set that allows them to do whole of society approaches to intelligence and information gathering. The PLA, to begin with, People's Liberation Army, is not a national military. It is a party army. It is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And every officer in the PLA, their oath is not to the constitution of the PRC, and they do have it. It is to maintain CCP rule. That matters here because that means that you can use the PLA, including its hackers and cyber specialists, to go and gather economic intelligence in ways that is frankly inappropriate, if not outright illegal, for anything from the CIA to the FBI to the NSA. Unit 61398, you may have heard about this, is a advanced persistent threat in AP. It is a unit of the Chinese military, and it has engaged in open economic espionage alongside military. Corporations in China benefit and engage in espionage. Huawei has been accused of espionage, not necessarily by hacking their own phones, but in the case of cooperation with T-Mobile, it was so blatant that at one point they took a mechanical arm, it fell into a worker's backpack, he took it home with him and didn't realize he had taken it home until Monday morning. If you believe that, I have bridged. Students and academics can be called upon. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not we should allow Chinese students into the United States. That's a very tough question. I don't have an answer, but I do want to note, it is not that every student who comes to the United States is a spy. They're not. It is that any student from China who comes to the United States may be called upon to spy. You go home to see your family between semesters or between school years. You may well be asked to have a nice chat with the local Ministry of State Security people who will talk to you about what it is that you are doing research on and the professors you're working with. And you should keep us informed on any interesting development. And then finally, shaping and molding perceptions. This, again, is something that we sort of do, kind of, but the Chinese are much more systematic about. This is part of political warfare. But again, it's not just the military. Confucius Institutes, which again have been in the news, are clearly part of the Chinese system. They are paid for by a branch of the Ministry of Education with state support. But they very clearly want to influence the kinds of questions and the kinds of issues that are going to be discussed in a school. So let me conclude by saying that China poses a fundamentally different challenge to any faced by the West in the past 2 centuries. The PRC is a system that has a different worldview from the rest of the world, but unlike the Soviets, they have a lot more resources to work with because they are the second largest economy. The threat posed by the PRC is one of whole of society, not just whole of government, partly because of the Marxist-Leninist nature of the CCP, partly because, given the CCP's rules, nothing is beyond its reach, and it can mobilize and activate elements. And ultimately, the threat posed by the PRC in this regard will include fundamental Western principles, including, relevant to this discussion, the rule of law, because China is not a rule of law society, but a rule by law society. And that has very distinct differences and implications, both in terms of internal governance and external interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. That was great, and we've got a healthy queue of questions for you. But I'm looking through the Q&A, and there's a couple of themes developing. One is, and I think this is probably a good question to start with because it sort of informs the rest of our discussion. What does China want? Do they want global domination? Do they want regional superiority, or do they want, different things in different spheres of society? What is your understanding, both from a party perspective and from a state perspective, that their medium and long-term goals are?
So I would say that one of the great ironies is that both the United States and China think of themselves as status quo. For us, it's kind of simple. We've been top dog for at least the last 100+ years. Arguably, we've been mostly top dog since our founding, dominating certainly the Western Hemisphere. We like the system, the international, international rules, norms, etc. We have pretty much broke those. So we like that status. But keep in mind, how old is the United States? 240 years old, roughly. China is 5,000 years. Throughout almost all of that history, it has dominated Asia, which, if you go back more than a few hundred years, is pretty much the entire world. Just as for Rome, Europe was the entire world. So their status quo is one where China dominates its environment, and all of its neighbors are, for most intents, tributaries, states that are certainly not going to balance against China. There's no history of balanced power in Asia. And the last 100 years, which, by the way, is coterminous with our period of dominance, is the aberration across 5,000 years. And by the way, across 5,000 years, 100 years is literally a sneeze. So what is it China wants? I think China wants to return to a world where it, one, dominates Asia, and all the neighbors understand their place, which is exactly what Yang Jiechi, now on the Politburo, but back in 2009, I think it was, at an ASEAN Regional Forum Summit, basically said, there are big powers, there are small powers, and that is just the way things are. Unfortunately, in today's world, China cannot maintain its economy purely based upon its own resources or even that of Asia. So it is unique in being a continental power that needs the world's oceans to bring resources back to China and to sell its, and in the information age, with a boundaryless internet, it wants to be able to tell people, no, just because you're in New York City does not give Falun Gong the right to spread lies about China, what the Chinese are trying. Just because you are in Paris does not mean Uyghurs should be allowed to call for independence. So it is a world that in some ways would see less intervention, because the Chinese frankly don't care if there is racial or ethnic or gender oppression in Nigeria or in the United States or other places. You do whatever you want. But when it touches on China, then you have to basically defer to China. That doesn't mean Chinese Marines on every street corner. I don't think that that is what they want. But in some ways, it's more insidious because what they want is self-censorship. That everywhere people would say, wow, do I want to offend my biggest trading partner, my biggest investor, my biggest source of infrastructure development?
So another first order question, and this comes up in the Q&A as well. You've talked a lot about sort of the party structure and also and what their aims are, and also some of the cultural norms that are driving Chinese policy. And I want to sort of step back and talk about cultural differences versus ideological differences. And just to set the stage, over the last couple of years, particularly towards the end of the Trump administration, we've heard quite a few public figures in the United States, sort of amplifying the differences between the U.S. and China, using language like China's an evil empire, and comparing our rivalry to our old rivalry with the Soviet Union. And so there are obviously some cultural frictions. I want to get into those in a bit in the context of economic espionage. That term alone, I think there's a cultural divide on what that means. But I just wanted to get your sense of, to what extent are we in, do we have a cultural challenge versus an ideological challenge? And if we have an ideological challenge, how does that inform how we're going to go about solving all of the frictions that we're seeing, every day now?
So I'd say actually there are three areas of friction. We have an ideological issue, we have a cultural issue, we also have a great power issue. So if we look at the US-Chinese competition, there are some aspects that would strike a Metternich, a Bethmann Hollweg, an Edward Gray as very familiar. Think back to 1911, 1913, 1890, right? Major power, lots of military capability, global interests running into each other and having friction. And I think that that is part of the competition. And there we need to recognize that if China became a democracy overnight tomorrow, that does not mean that China's government, whatever it looked like, let's call it, a democratic government in China, would say, oh, to Taiwan, hey, you want independence? Go ahead. I mean, run up whatever flag you want. Just don't call yourself the Republic of Taiwan because that's a bad acronym. But otherwise, do whatever you want. Go ahead. Tibetans, go forth and no. That is rooted in aspects of history and culture. The CCP plays to that. The CCP exploits that. But the CCP didn't create that. It has deepened it, but we need to recognize it. Is there an ideological aspect? Yes. Not because the Chinese are trying to spread their ideology. I would defy you to point out governments that the Chinese have overthrown since Deng Xiaoping. Certainly they have influenced many with everything from money to investment to politics. But again, how is that different from great power politics? The problem is that the CCP sees itself as facing an existential threat from the United States, not because we're going to nuke them tomorrow morning, but because we say things like we believe in freedom and democracy and popular representation and one man, one vote, and all those sorts of things. And we're not trying to overthrow the Chinese government, certainly not formally, but from Beijing's perspective, how would I know? Because you keep pushing for things like Hong Kong should be able to speak out on its own. So one of the interesting problems this raises from the ideological perspective is if you think you are facing an existential threat at an ideological level, what are you willing to stop that? How far would you go to defend yourself? So it's not that China is trying to raise the 5-star flag over the capital. It is that the Chinese feel that we are, and it's not that we're trying to raise the stars and stripes over the Forbidden City. It is that we are challenging the very essence of the CCP as a Marxist-Leninist party, Marxist-Leninist Maoist, and its rule. And then, of course, there is a separate cultural issue, which is rooted in the reality that China comes from a fundamentally different starting point and set of perspectives than any challenger has in the last 200 years. And let me just note here, what about Japan? You hear this a lot. Japan is not, in 1853, Japan is not a Western country. But the Japanese empire was modeled after European imperial practice. Formal colonies that would be economically tied to Tokyo, etc. It was explicitly part of the European-centered age of empire. Chinese imperialism is still imperialism, but it took very different shapes and forms. And by the way, Imperial China's attitude towards Central Asians was actually very different from Imperial China's attitudes towards its coastal neighbors. So all of which were rather different from the European model of formal colonies that were economically and politically tied, which is what the Japanese.
So I want to stay on this cultural difference for just a moment, because I've got a couple of questions coming in on this. I'll tell you from my perspective as a former prosecutor, I sort of previewed this. When I was prosecuting economic espionage cases, particularly relating to Chinese intellectual property theft, there was a huge cultural disconnect on sort of how Chinese nationals looked at the concept of property, right? And the concept of theft in that context. And then you add on the layer of state control, even over private entities, as you described, and the sort of murky relationship between or murky boundary between the state and the private sector. The whole concept of conducting espionage by giving intellectual property to a state entity was just, they were looking at me like I had 3 heads for thinking that was something wrong. So I can think of a lot of different ways we can talk about how the cultural disconnect plays out in policy and law, just like that. But we've got a few members of the quite a few members of the military here, and there's a question that keeps coming up. What are just like I had blind spots as a prosecutor, what are our blind spots from a US perspective, particularly with regard to the military? But if you want to take it further than that, from a cultural perspective, what are we not getting that we should be getting?
How much time do we have? We don't get a lot of this. So this will be a lightning. First off, this is not your father's PLA. This is not a military that believes that quantity will overwhelm quality, that you will run out of AMRAAMs, harpoons, Mark 48, ad caps, 120 millimeter APF SDS rounds before they run out of bombs. This is a military that is a learning entity. Samuel Huntington's Soldier in the State may well have missed the mark when it comes to PLA. This is a military that has paid very close attention to how we fight our wars and is not stealing, not even emulating, but it is using that as something of a template to build joint operations with Chinese characteristics. This is a society that is capable of innovation. We for some reason, think dictatorships can't innovate. We forget that it was the Nazis, one of the really authoritarian groups out there. I don't think anyone questions that they were pretty authoritarian, that came up with jet fighters, assault weapons, infrared, lights for the battlefield. You can innovate even if you're a dictatorship. And China is trying very hard to innovate in key areas like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. They are leading edge. They are not stealing from us because in some of those areas, they are ahead of us, or certainly are equal. I think the other things to sort of within that context then is to recognize that this is a very different entity. And it really troubles me when people say, well, we know how to handle the Chinese. We defeated the Soviets. The Soviets were economically much weaker. They were frankly far more impatient. And they didn't become the best friend in trading terms with just about every country on the planet. If we wanted to contain China, we're about 30 years behind the mark. So we better come up with a different strategy than, well, we'll just contain China. And of course, all of our allies will sign up for that. The European Union just signed a new trade deal with the Chinese. They left the issue of Uyghurs and stuff on the sideline. So again, there aren't too many good analogies for what we faced in the past to apply to China.
So you've just discussed sort of where we may have made missteps. I'd like to talk a little bit about where maybe China has made missteps. So there's General Mattis earlier today was talking about, he mentioned China in passing, but there's the sort of wolf diplomacy and their sort of aggressive stance on certain issues when it comes to negotiating with foreign powers. And it seems to me that part of what drives that mentality are some of the cultural and party incentives that you described in your talk, which is that if you're sort of managing up, right, and you're trying to appease the party above all else, and you want to show that you're taking a hard line, then that can have repercussions, and you might not get everything you want out of the relationship with foreign partners. And so, yes, there have been instances, a lot of instances, like you said, where, and the U.S. has been, as guilty of this as anyone, where they place certain issues to the side so that they can have some sort of engagement with them. But do you think in a quiet moment, there are members of the CCCP who are saying, wow, we really miscalculated this or that in our approach to our engagement with other countries?
Well, one, yes, I think that absolutely in quiet moments, there's a lot of reflection. How much of that is fed up to Xi Jinping is a very good question. Xi himself is more powerful. He has clearly used his anti-corruption efforts of the last 9 years to systematically reshape the party. He is more of an individual dictator than certainly Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, and in some ways, perhaps even more than Deng Xiaoping. I think one of the great weaknesses of the Chinese is, and I try to point this out when we all meet in person. If you were to look around the room, you would see that what does the average American look like? The answer is there is no average. They may be Asian, maybe Black, they may be Hispanic, maybe white, they may be mixed race. Where do they come from? Everywhere, right? As immigrants, as children or grandchildren of immigrants. That is a heterogeneity that is missing in China. China is in some ways like Japan in the sense that it does not welcome or want immigrants. It is an authoritarian system, so information flow is constrained. The culture of China, leaving aside the CCP, is one where information has always been power, and information has always been spread by titration. Think back to your high school chemistry. Titration is when you literally let one drop at a time out of the big tube. Because information flow is power, always was even before the information. So in this context, there is a lot of suspicion. China is a low trust society, as Nicholas Everstein. And China is increasingly arrogant, which doesn't excuse our arrogance, of course. But the combination of not being able to put yourself in other people's shoes and the sense of we're back, we're bad, you need to all respect us, antagonizes. I mean, I would like to think it would be pretty unthinkable for an American embassy to send a letter out saying, your nurses abandoned your people in your nursing homes, so you are in no position to criticize the United States. Yet that is apparently what the Chinese embassy in Paris did at the beginning of COVID. The part of the issue here, however, is that China appears to be strong, and a lot of people buy into this in a way that intimidates people from the get-go. If you think that the Chinese are already beating you 5 ways to Sunday, you may decide that you don't want to challenge them, even when they are arrogant, obnoxious, and overbearing, and all the rest. Ceding them dominance at the table before you even sit down is a bad approach.
So I want to come back. We're running up on 150 when we've got to stop. So I do want to get to economic espionage because it's a real interest of mine. And one thing that I thought was interesting about your talk is you talked about a distinction between China's whole of society approach versus a whole of government approach. And the US government sometimes likes to talk about how we have a whole of government approach. And I'm thinking about this specifically in the context of DOJ, where you've seen the increasing use over the last 6 years or so, the use of criminal tools to address Chinese intellectual property theft in particular. There's an entire DOJ initiative called the China Initiative to try to prioritize these kinds of cases. And DOJ, like a lot of arms of the US government, thinks of itself, I think if you talk to most in leadership would think like, we're part of a whole of government approach to China. There's been some criticism of that approach, maybe overreach, and certainly some academics that have been targeted as part of that initiative have had some legitimate complaints. And so there's a whole discussion to be had about sort of what the downsides of that approach might be. But I want to look at it just sort of from a utilitarian perspective of, does this work? From the Chinese perspective, does criminalizing this kind of conduct and aggressively going after, what kind of effect does that have from the Chinese perspective? And in particular, you mentioned towards the end of your talk this distinction between rule of law versus rule by law. And I'm wondering if you unpack that a little bit, if that informs how they perceive some of these initiatives.
So you used to work for DOJ. So you understand as well as anyone that we have an independent judiciary. I mean, what is it? Law and Order, the old intro, the American criminal system has, the police and the prosecutors, the police arrest, and then it hands over to prosecutors, defenders, and judges. Why? Because we have an independent judiciary, and that is separate from the police and investigators and law enforcement. That is deeply embedded in our culture, not just American culture, but of course, English common law, etc. There is no parallel to this in China. In the imperial system, magistrates were appointed by the emperor. They were judge, jury, in some cases, de facto executioner, police, and detectives. And the idea that you would prosecute the emperor, as we saw recently with 2 impeachments of President Trump, and before that, of course, Presidents Clinton and Andrew Johnson, is inconceivable. Does anyone really think that you would prosecute Xi Jinping on a legal basis? So that's the rule of law versus rule by law. Our use of DOJ and other legal instruments, as well as Department of Commerce instruments, from the Chinese perspective, is simply rule by law. We are using legal tools and instruments to prosecute a conflict against China without using force. Obviously, that's not true. I would fundamentally disagree with that. But if you are Beijing, you look at this and you sort of say, well, yeah, I kind of expected that. That being said, they also recognize the power. This is why legal warfare is part of the Chinese concept of political warfare. And let me just note here that I think one of the most powerful tools we have at our disposal is the use of domestic law. Personally, if I had the authority, I would say we should prosecute Chinese corporations under RICO, under the conspiracy issue. Because if you are trading in stolen stereos, and there's a network of people who steal the stereos and sell the stereos across state lines, that makes it a federal conspiracy. I'm not a lawyer, so if I'm wrong, please tell me so. I just realized I'm talking to a virtual room full of lawyers about the law. This is one of the more stupid things I've ever done. But if you would treat a truckload of stereos this way, why wouldn't you treat 20 terabytes of intellectual property the same way? And my understanding is that increasingly we are thinking about using things like RICO statutes to go after entities like Huawei, which we know have benefited from stolen intellectual property. And it's not just intellectual property. You haven't said this, but some people, it's like, look, okay, so they steal some intellectual property. Yeah. First, we are talking about billions of dollars of information. But second of all, it is that this is not prosecuted, is acceding to their idea that it's somehow okay. That at the end of the day, it's really espionage, and all states engage in espionage, so there's no real problem. That's not true. It isn't true for any of our other neighbors and partners, who some do economic espionage, but nothing on this scale. And when it's Israel or the Netherlands or Japan, they are at the end of the day capitalist countries and allies, and China is needed.
So I'm seeing that I'm getting the signal that we have 2 minutes left, which gives us time for probably just one more question. And so I want to give you the opportunity to have some closing thoughts. But to sort of frame that, I think we can't end this discussion without sort of thinking about the last year or so, when it seems like we've had this just event after event, whether it's a pandemic, whether it is the ongoing battle over 5G and the executive orders that came out, relating to TikTok and WeChat, whether it's the tightening of restrictions in Hong Kong. It seems like it sometimes the information flow seems to be overwhelming, and we're fighting all of these different fronts. if Dean Chang was, emperor for a day, or Joe Biden for a day, I guess, how do we make sense of all these? And if you were to think about how to prioritize, first of all, all of these things, are sort of coming at us at once. What's going to have staying power? And how do we prioritize these different perceived threats that we have, looking at the next 5 to 10 years?
I think the Chinese have one thing right, which is you cannot be strong if you're not economically strong. I am not worried about the Chinese nuking Pearl Harbor, literally or virtually. I am somewhat worried about Taiwan. I have no idea how we are going to pay back the COVID bill, the second COVID bill, plus all the stuff that we have accumulated before. We have a huge shortfall when it comes to entitlement spending, which will then intrude into discretionary spending like defense, like R&D, like NASA. So what I would say is, and I don't have an answer for President Biden or anyone else, but if we don't get our arms around the economic challenges facing the United States, we are simply not going to be able to confront the Chinese. And the great irony here is China, even now, is only about 75% of our GDP, and that's based on Chinese figures, so it's probably a bit less. It's not clear that they will catch up with us. I'm sorry I throw that out there at the last second. But we can certainly squander what remains of our lead if we don't get our own house.
Well, this has been fascinating. We could continue this discussion, obviously, for the rest of the afternoon. But thank you, Dean, for giving us a lot to think about. I have learned a lot. It's been a fantastic discussion. And I think everybody can see why you're such a popular guest here at the conference. So thanks for joining us again. And we will see everybody at the top of the hour.
Thank you for having me.